Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Audrey Lewis and Christine Podmaniczky, authors of Andrew Wyeth in Retrospect.
Our guests today are Christine Podmaniczky and Audrey Lewis, and they are the co-authors of this book, Andrew Wyeth in Retrospect. Christine, we'll start with you. Can you tell us where we're sitting?
I can. We're sitting in Andrew Wyeth's principal Pennsylvania studio. This is the studio that Andrew Wyeth moved into in 1940, and he worked here on his Pennsylvania tempera paintings, dry brush watercolors, and regular watercolors too, although a lot of those watercolors he did out in the field. But this was his principal studio from 1940 until just several months before he died. And we're sitting in the room, actually, in which he painted. The building itself is an old schoolhouse. It was built in 1875, and this portion of it from the outside even looks like an old schoolhouse. But in 1925, Andrew Wyeth's father, N.C. Wyeth, the great illustrator who lives just down the lane here from this building, who lived just down the lane from this building, realized that this building, this old schoolhouse, was decommissioned and it was coming on the market. So he knew that he had a number of talented children coming along in his family who needed studios. So he purchased this building and began to turn it into studio space. And actually the first Wyeth to work here was his daughter Henriette. And she and her husband Peter Hurd worked here until about 1940, when both of them left to go to the Southwest, to New Mexico. So that very same year, Andrew Wyeth and his sweetheart, Betsy, were married. They went to Maine to honeymoon for the summer, and by the time they came back, N.C. Wyeth had renovated this place for Andrew as his studio. And the interesting thing here is that not only was it Andrew's studio for the first 20 or so years of Andrew working here, it was also his residence. And so he and Betsy lived in this building, and they also raised their two sons here in this building as well.
So if you had come here when he was working in this room, what would you have seen?
Actually, the room, I think, looks pretty much the way it must have at the time. I think some of the paint was probably a little bit fresher, but one of the things about Andrew was that both he and his father sort of liked the natural aging of surfaces, and they weren't up to redecorating and that sort of thing. So the studio does have a little bit of a, let's say, lived-in air about it. It's all over the wall. There are photographs of the people and the places that meant something to Andrew Wyeth. There's, of course, right behind me, an easel he would have worked on, large mirrors in the room, because he often would look at things through a mirror, paintings he was working on through a mirror for a little different perspective. Drawers where he kept papers and things like that, special papers. And then all along the windowsill, he has, there are jars of pigments that he would have used in his tempera paintings.
You're the curator of this
I am
building?
the curator of N.C. Wyeth collections at the Brandywine River Museum, and also the curator of the museum's historic properties. We have three. We have this building, which is called the Andrew Wyeth Studio. We have N.C. Wyeth's studio, where Andrew Wyeth was a student at his father's feet. And then we also have the Kerner Farm, which was a place of great inspiration to Andrew Wyeth, and one I'm sure Audrey will speak more about.
Audrey, when did you start getting interested in Andrew Wyeth?
Well, I grew up in this area, so I had known of him since I was 12 or so, because my parents had a reproduction of roasted chestnuts in their bedroom. So I knew of his work, but I really didn't come to know his work in depth until I was working here for several years, and I was asked to take on the Andrew Wyeth exhibition, a retrospective exhibition, that was to be held this 2017. And so at that time, it was 4 years ago, I started studying in depth. And that's how I really came to it. As Christine said, the Kerner farm was a really important subject for him through his career, and so was Chadds Ford. This is where we're sitting right now, Chadds Ford in Delaware County. And I lived not too far from here, so I was familiar with the area and very interested in the idea that he was so devoted to this particular place.
Now, we're here to talk about this book that is, or you call it a catalog, from the show. Can you talk about, if somebody buys this, what they get?
Well, the approach to the exhibition and to the catalog was to chronicle the career of Andrew Wyeth in a chronological way, but to also look at thematic aspects of his work. So it really was wide-ranging and focused at the same time. There have been other exhibitions in the past 10 years that have looked at his work thematically, but we wanted to really look at his whole career since he died in 2009, that we thought this would be an opportune moment. Also the fact that it's the 100-year anniversary of his birth. So that's how we really began to focus on the chronology of his career and to take real interest in how his career developed through the decades, and then to take from that certain subjects, such as Christine writes about in the catalog, his war memories, also the influence of film on his work, and then various other subjects. And we had one person, Patricia Junker, who chronicles the career. I write about portraits, and there are 7 authors altogether. So it's a pretty, I would say, it's in-depth catalog.
What did you learn about him putting this all together?
I think I learned that he was very complex, more complex than I thought, because I had gone to art. I had been an art history graduate student. He's not really taught in graduate school, at least in the past. So I didn't really know his work because he was outside the kind of the curriculum in a way, because he wasn't a modernist working in the 20th century. He was still working as he preferred in a realist idiom really throughout his career. So he sort of fell off the canon, the map, so to speak, in terms of my study. So I learned a lot about him as a realist and how he wasn't just this isolated figure who locked himself away, like reclusive, and that's sometimes how he's been perceived. But he was this very smart, aware person, artist who knew what was happening in the art world, but chose the path that he chose and really was devoted to 2 subjects, or I should say 2 locations, here in Chadds Ford in Pennsylvania and in Maine.
I ask both of you, what did he think about what the art world thought of him? And did his art change as the art world changed?
Well, he says he was not bothered by the criticism of his work. So I should first say he was a popular artist throughout his entire career with the public. And he was popular with critics at the beginning of his career in the 1930s into the 40s. And then things changed a lot in the art world. Abstract Expressionism, Jackson Pollock, Franz Klein, these artists emerged. And he was not opposed to that at all. He had no criticism of their work. You know, he was open, he said, to all expressions. And he hit some hard times in terms of criticism in the 60s, mostly, and the 70s. He was considered old-fashioned, conservative, sentimental. In the book it says, in 1967, champions of new art looking back on 30 years of Wyeth's development regarded his body of work as monotonous, sentimental, and passé. Right. And he didn't really respond to those criticisms in print. He had a pretty thick skin, I think. But whether he changed is a very interesting question, because at that point he began to really paint new subjects. He started painting a series of nudes, and both of them were really almost underground in that they were painted out of the view of the public, and in particular one subject, Helga Testorf, who was painted in secret really for 15 years, from 1970 to 85. And sometimes I think that his exploration of the nude was a way really of getting away from that perception of him. Not that he changed his approach to art, but that he changed, I think he wanted to be seen as much more complex than he had been.
Christine, how did he think he fit in with the rest of the art world? Did he have friends who were artists? Did they kind of hang around together?
Edward Hopper?
Well,
Really?
but wasn't really a friend per se, right? I mean, he did have interactions with other artists. He, for example, sat on a jury with Edward Hopper, right, on an art jury. But I think that he was so secure in what he was doing that he didn't give heed to the criticism. He was that secure. Yeah. And he also had, as Audrey said, the thing that goaded the critics, I think, even more was that he was extremely popular. There's the whole myth that grew up, if you will, around, gosh, now I'm going to forget, the painting in Maine.
Christina's World.
Christina's World, of course. How can I possibly forget that?
Christina's World, yeah.
Right. I mean, that was one of the best-known paintings of the century.
Yes.
And I think the more popular he became, the more rapid the critics became, in a way.
I want to read this in a chapter that is written by Henry Adams that neither of you wrote, but he said when Wyeth shipped the painting, Christina's World, to a New York gallery, he commented in discouragement to his wife, "This painting is a complete flat tire." And today, Christina's World is one of 2 or 3 of the most familiar American paintings in the 20th century. What makes it so iconic?
I think people read a lot into it from their own perception, their own emotions. And so I've heard people talk about that painting in many different ways. You know, what is she crawling towards? It's a young woman, appears to be a young woman crawling up this hill. Is she happy? Is she sad? I think there's a lot of mystery in that painting, and that's intriguing to people. And also, it's a compelling subject. People may realize that she's handicapped and then read into it further that this is a person who's struggling. So I think there's many sides to that painting in terms of public perception. And also, it's been so widely reproduced that it's sort of ingrained in people's thoughts. And so people come at it, or scholars come at it with a different perspective. They're suspicious of it, you know, that it's too sentimental, cloying. In fact, you know, Wyeth had come to that subject quite naturally when he was in Maine. He was looking out the window and he saw Christina Olson, who was the subject of many paintings by him, as was the property that she lived on, the Olson property in Cushing, Maine, throughout, from 1939 through her death in 1968. So she preoccupied a lot of his imagination. And so he had once said that he almost wished that he had left her out of the painting. And I found that really interesting. And I think it was, I don't know, it's partly that there was so much attention paid to the painting at the exclusion of other work, or that so many people focused on the figure that they weren't really getting at what Wyeth's own thoughts were about the painting.
Did she get any kind of celebrity over this? I mean, did people want to go meet her, or did she make appearances or anything like that?
She was pretty quiet, kept to herself, reclusive in a way.
Right, but I think people did travel down the peninsula in Maine to, yes, knock on her door and see this. Of course, that was, you said she died in 16?
She died in 1968.
In 68.
January, yeah.
So, you know, it was, that's early on, and people
Came after that a lot, yeah.
Came after it, but I think they probably came while she was still alive too. I mean, they had to travel down the peninsula in dirt roads and find them out, and they were part of a community which the Olsons were part of a community which would have protected them certainly from great hordes of people. You know, someone arrives asking, well, where does Christina Olson live? You were apt to get maybe not too clear directions. Right, exactly. But yeah, she did have a certain amount of notoriety, I think, because of the painting.
Well, on that note, as you approach the outside door here, there's a sign that says something like, I'm working, I don't give autographs.
Right, I don't give autographs. And that is, that sign, as far as we can tell, was put up sometime in the 1990s when Andrew Wyeth, of course, again, would have been extremely popular. And really kind of the same sort of thing. People would arrive in Chadsport, they'd go over to Hank's, the local diner, and they'd ask, well, how do I find Andrew Wyeth? Well, again, they were liable to get sort of a less than complete direction. But and the fact that this studio, Andrew Wyeth he was away during the summer. Of course, he was in Maine, and while he was away, all the vines and things would grow up over the studio, and he kind of let things grow like that because it shielded him from the road that was out here. He would, when he came here to paint, he would pull his car all the way in and around behind the building so that people wouldn't know he was here. He was a very, very intensely personal man and artist, and he just simply didn't want people knocking on the door, bothering him.
He really wanted anyone to see him when he's working. That was pretty consistent throughout his career, and he wouldn't show paintings to Betsy even until they were finished. He would bring them home to the house up the road after they had moved there around 1960.
Early 60s.
He would bring the finished work there, but Betsy didn't come to the studio very often, I don't think, did she?
No, not when this
was
right, just the studio. After they moved up the river, she didn't come here very often.
Was he a recluse, or would people see him at the local grocery store?
They would. I wouldn't call him a recluse at all. He had local friends in all the pockets, you know, at Hank's and at the various little neighborhoods around. Lots of local friends. I wouldn't call him
them.
Yeah, and he painted them. Right, exactly. I wouldn't call him reclusive at all. It was just your publicity, your autograph seekers that he didn't want to deal with.
He had a really interesting sense of humor, I think. I've heard a lot about that. He would play pranks, practical jokes. So he is not just like what you see in his paintings. I think people have said to me during the run of the exhibition that they thought of him as someone who didn't smile and was this very serious person, and that isn't what I've learned of him.
If a fan would come up to him if he was at a restaurant or something, would he just tell him to go away?
I don't know. I've never heard of that happening. I don't think he was going into Philadelphia to restaurants too often.
So he didn't play the celebrity? Did he do anything?
No, not at all.
No, he wasn't interested in celebrity.
If you were to be a fly on the wall in this room when he was working, what would you have seen?
I think you would see a little, chaos in a sense, because while he was working on the tempera, he would have his studies, watercolor studies, pencil studies, dry brush studies, and he would be throwing them around the room while he was working. He would walk on them. He wasn't particularly neat about it. He liked that spontaneity, and so that's what you would see, that it was not this man sitting in front of a canvas just painting, or a panel and just painting. It was really much more animated.
Sure.
Do you know if he worked fast or slow?
We understand that he worked quickly. His son Jamie has said several times, several anecdotes, that he painted like a wild man, that he, in some cases, would, using broad brushes, just be slapping painting everywhere and that sort of thing. Certainly there are enough paint spatters here on the floor for one to believe those stories. But also, you have to realize that he was painting in tempera, which is a little bit, it's a mixture of pigment, egg yolk and water, and you have to realize that it does take some, well, it takes more than some, it takes a lot of concentration to use this medium, and so you need to be certainly aware of what you're doing, I think deliberate in some cases with what you're doing.
Why did he use that medium?
Well,
What would you say?
I would say, well, first he used watercolor as well. So watercolor was more or less what he would call his free side. And then the tempera was more measured. When he started painting in tempera, I think he liked the earthiness of it. Also that you could build layer upon layer, almost like building with the earth. He has said such things to his biographer, Richard Merriman, that he just felt more comfortable with tempera than oil. He worked in oil briefly.
And I would say that one of the reasons he chose to tempera and watercolor is those were the two mediums that his father did not work in. And there were times when Andrew Wyeth was all for just a complete break with his father. Andrew Wyeth was not going to be an illustrator like his father was, and his father was uncomfortable with tempera, and C. Wyeth tried in the late 30s to do tempera painting, and although his tempers are beautiful, he was just not really comfortable with it. NC liked that slide of the oil paint more. And I think when someone says, why did Andrew Wyeth choose to paint in tempera, the first thing that comes to my mind is, well, because his father didn't, is sort of the answer.
Well, speaking of N.C. Wyeth, Christine, you mentioned you're the curator of the N.C. Wyeth?
I'm curator of N.C. Wyeth collections here at the museum, and of the historic properties, one of which is N.C. Wyeth's studio.
And if people don't know anything about N.C. Wyeth, what should they know?
Well, he was one of the most famous illustrators of the first half of the 20th century. In the so-called sort of golden age of illustration, N.C. Wyeth worked from probably about 1905 until, say, 1935, with really top drawer, just famous illustrations for many stories, for both adult stories and children's stories. He's most famous for a series called the Scribner's Classics, and that would have been Treasure Island and The Boy's King Arthur and Robinson Crusoe and that sort of thing. So the interesting thing there is, of course, Andrew Wyeth grew up with a father who had this incredible imagination, who was basically retelling these stories visually, setting the stage for these stories. So that's the start, I think, of fostering an imagination in his son.
Was N.C. the one who decided the family should live here at Chadds Ford?
Yes, N.C. absolutely was. He came here as a Howard Pyle student. Howard Pyle had a school of illustration in Wilmington, and which N.C. Wyeth joined in the late fall of 1902. And then every year, Howard Pyle would take his students to Chadds Ford as sort of a summer school. So in the summer of 1903, N.C. Wyeth came here. He was a displaced New Englander. He was terribly homesick, and for some reason, this countryside reminded him of his New England countryside. He absolutely fell in love with the area, and while he did go back to Wilmington and actually bought his first house in Wilmington because there was a little group of students that stayed around Howard Pyle in Wilmington for a while. He very quickly, by 1908, he and his wife had decided they would settle here, and in fact they rented a house here for 3 years, an old farmhouse, until they purchased this property, which is basically adjacent to this property we're at now. That was 18 acres in 1911. It's actually the house, you could say, that Treasure Island built, because he used the money that he had earned from the Treasure Island Commission as a down payment for the property.
And as curator of the N.C. Wyeth collection, what does that involve? What do you have to do?
Oh, well, it involves a lot of fun, actually. We have quite a large collection of N.C. Wyeth paintings at the museum. And
the museum is the Brandywine River
Brandywine
Museum.
River Museum of Art, yes. And it's my pleasure to decide which ones get put out.
Oh, you rotate them?
Yes, absolutely. Rotate them as much as we can. And you know, sometimes I rotate them on the basis of anniversaries, what's going on in history, that sort of thing. For example, this year, 2017, is the 200th anniversary of the birth of Henry David Thoreau, and N.C. Wyeth did 2 paintings of Thoreau. So we've had those in the gallery for a little while, for sometime this summer, just sort of in celebration of that. We have more paintings than gallery space. Sometimes I wish I could get them all in, so we have to rotate them.
Did N.C. Wyeth decide fairly early on that Andrew Wyeth was going to be an artist?
I think Andrew really
yeah.
started himself. And I don't, from a young age, Andrew Wyeth was painting and drawing.
Sure, and the fact of the matter is that there were 4 children before Andrew Wyeth, and 3 of those had already shown artistic inclination. So although I'm sure NC didn't force Andrew to be an artist, there was art in the air. Right? There's a letter that N.C. Wyeth wrote that's really, I love it. He's describing to someone the after dinner parlor trick, he calls it. Everyone's sitting around drawing, painting. The whole family was sitting. His wife didn't, of course.
Well, is there an artistic gene? I mean, can somebody be born with artistic talent like that, or is it just the atmosphere that they grew up in that caused them to all be artists?
I think it's a little bit of both, I would think. I mean, that's always, I guess that's a very
I don't know. I'm
question
not a
nature or nurture, but I would think that, I would think there's a little bit of both. But yeah, Andrew Wyeth's son Jamie is an artist.
Right. Certainly there was the atmosphere. I mean, it was just art, and yes, fed, constantly nurtured. For N.C. Wyeth, the most precious thing he could give his children was an imagination, to learn to use their imagination.
When was it that Andrew Wyeth started getting noticed by the art world?
Well, 1937. His work was shown at the Macbeth Gallery in New York City, which was a gallery of American art, and he showed his watercolors from Maine. And he had actually gone to the Macbeth Gallery the summer before, I believe, and brought his work there, and they were really impressed with it. So he had a show, 1937, in October, I believe, and it was sold out within a couple days, maybe 2 days, and he received a lot of press notice at the time, New York press, and that really was the launching pad. And those works were very different from what people think of as a typical Andrew Wyeth. They were the Maine coast. He painted them during the summers. They're brilliant blues and purples and very, very gestural, spontaneous. And they remind one of Winslow Homer, who was somebody who Wyeth idolized, especially at a young age. And they're very reminiscent of his work. So 1937, and then he showed again the following year at the Macbeth. So that began his career, and then other people took notice, like the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art, included him in an exhibition that was very critical to his career in 1943, a group exhibition. And so that really began the attention being brought to him for his watercolors. But then his tempers drew attention too.
You said there's a different, something fundamentally different about his watercolors than his tempera?
Yeah, well, the watercolors, and there's a couple phases of his watercolors, really. This 1937 through 1941 or so was really this particular group of paintings that were in the Winslow Homer tradition, more or less. After that, he wanted to find his own voice, and he started moving in different directions. But the way he approached watercolor was very different than he did with his temperas, because he could be more spontaneous with the watercolors, and he called that his free side. He was able to express himself very freely, almost wild.
Would you recognize it as being two works by the same artist, or could it be? Is it that different?
I don't think it's. I think I can recognize it. Yes, the early work is surprising to people because of the palette. His palette really changes in the 40s to become more monochromatic in a sense. Lots of ochres and umbras and gray, and so people tend to think of him with that limited palette. But color does come into his work sporadically. But yeah, at that point, I can see it. I don't know whether everyone can see it. I feel like there's some of the dry brushes, that I should explain that technique. Dry brush is a watercolor technique, but in it he squeezes out the water from the brush and almost draws with the pigment. So it has a similar effect as the tempera.
Tempera, right.
Yeah. So there's like three things with Wyeth. There's the watercolor, transparent watercolor, and pencil, and then there's the dry brush, and then the tempera. And he would say they all represent different sides of him.
If you looked at, say, 10 of his pieces, could you put them in order that they took place? Did his style evolve over time?
You probably could now.
I could now. With his temperas, I think I could. The watercolors are sometimes they're parts of something. They're a means to an end, in a sense. Some of the watercolors. He was interested in the flora and fauna of this area, so there's lots of studies of trees and of leaves and of the ground, of the earth.
And some of those, the interesting thing to me, and we show some of them here in the studio for our tours, is some of those watercolor studies are so loose as to be almost abstract, right. And then some of them are the nature studies, yeah. Very realistic, very painstakingly but beautifully done.
Yeah, and he always said that he was not just a realist. He also was an abstractionist, not in the sense that you think of as Jackson Pollock, but in the sense that shapes and forms were very important to him. So that we do have these spontaneous watercolors where it's a little disorienting. You're not sure where you are in them. And sometimes the studies as well for particular paintings. He'll go through a series of studies and each of them develop in a different way. And he said he never started the same way. He always, he let the work direct him. And his own persona, I think, is always in his work. No matter whether he's painting a portrait of Christina Olson or Carl Kerner, there's always Andrew Wyeth in that.
Do you know if he ever got well into a painting or done a painting and think this is garbage and destroyed it?
I'm sure he did, because I don't know about temperas.
I think I've heard that he's definitely scraped out passages, yeah, or sandpapered out passages. Yeah. I know one of the, the German, where he talks in an interview about being absolutely stuck with this painting of Carl Kerner, his neighbor Carl Kerner, in a German uniform and helmet, and he's absolutely stuck with it. He can't go any further. And then he decides, he was a great risk taker at some points, and so he decides he's just going to pour some black ink or whatever on this painting and manipulate it the way you would and see what happens. And we're left with what happened, which is really quite wonderful. So
Yes,
yes, he did. He was willing to take those risks of scraping stuff out or...
Yeah, and even when he didn't scrape things out, he was always editing himself. So there is a painting like Groundhog Day, which is at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and is reproduced in the book. It went through many phases. He had Anna Kerner in it. He had a dog in it. He took the Anna Kerner out. She was sleeping, then she wasn't, and then at the end, you're left with something completely different. And you're a single solitary table setting and a view through a window. So he was always editing, distilling, finding the essence of what his subject is. And it was developing out in his mind as he went along.
Now, in this book, each of you wrote a chapter, and Christine, I want to ask you about your chapter. It's Andrew Wyeth's War Memory, the Enduring Influence of N.C. Wyeth and World War I. Now, why did you either choose that chapter or get that topic assigned to you?
Oh, well, I chose it actually because as curator of the historic properties, I was aware that in both this property, the Andrew Wyeth Studio and the N.C. Wyeth Studio, there are an awful lot of World War I artifacts. And I also was very much aware of N.C. Wyeth's work during World War I. He illustrated some articles for journals. He did some poster work, that sort of thing. And I know that because he was not one of those artists that went abroad, he made a great effort to collect artifacts from World War I, actually while the war was going on, as best he could, uniforms and helmets and things like that. But he also collected the visual resources he needed to illustrate the war. If he was handed a commission, he needed to be able to do this realistically and factually. So he for example, saved from the New York Times over 300 pages from what was called their rotogravure section. Every Sunday, the Times would publish this. It was either a 5 or 7 or 8 page rotogravure section where they would have the war pictures, the pictures from the war that were cleared for publication by the War Office, and this N.C. Wyeth saved all of these so that he could see what the officers' uniforms looked like, what the enlisted men's uniforms looked, what the bombed out villages of France looked like. He needed all this information. So he saved that. There were all these visual resources in his studio. Well, Andrew Wyeth, 10 years later, as an 8, 9, 10-year-old, he came along and expressed an interest in World War I, as any boy might at that age. And he had all of these resources in his father's studio available to him. So by that time there were stereoscope cards, the war in 3D basically, that you would pop this stereoscope card in a viewer and you could see the battlefields of France, the bombed out villages in 3D. He would put on an overcoat. Andrew Wyeth would put on a German overcoat or put an American helmet on. His parents bought him would buy him periodically for birthdays or Christmases, these little statues, military miniatures. They were about 4 1/4 inches high. They were actually German made at that time by 2 different companies in Germany. And they were sold in the United States. His parents would buy them at Wanamaker's for Christmas or birthday. And he actually ended up, as an adult, having a collection of over 900 of these. So the war was, for this young boy, it was a big thing. And the interesting part of it was not only was he playing war and looking at war pictures, Andrew Wyeth was also drawing war at that point. That was his art expression. And there are literally remaining, I would say, a couple hundred anyhow, of his juvenile drawings where he's drawing his soldiers in battle position, where he's putting them into trenches, or he's drawing tanks and and he's blowing them up, great explosions. And Audrey talked about, the watercolors, this very free, easy watercolor that Andrew Wyeth burst upon the art world. Well, it's my contention that he was able to do that because as a child, he had become very familiar with watercolor medium as he worked with all these drawings. He was no longer afraid of it. He knew how to make these beautiful swishes. He had a little idea of what was going to happen. And it was not something he learned from his father. His father was an oil painter, and his father could draw, but his father wasn't, although there are a few NC watercolors, his father was not a watercolorist. And so Andrew, as a young artist bursting upon the scene in New York, he had to draw from somewhere. And I think it was these early battle pictures of his. Imagery, World War I imagery goes throughout Andrew Wyeth's career. An essay in the book is by Henry Adams, a scholar who talks a lot about the effects of the movie, the 1925 silent movie, The Big Parade, on Andrew Wyeth's work. And that was a war movie that Andrew saw at 8 years old, and that he continued to see for the rest of his life. It was a favorite movie of his. We still have a reel-to-reel projector here in this studio that he used to show he would screen the film for anyone he could get to stay and watch it. Henry Adams estimates he saw it over 500 times.
And Henry Adams drew a connection between that movie and Christina's World painting?
He did. And he also, he drew more of a connection, I think, between that and another painting by Andrew Wyeth called Winter, 1946. And this was the first major tempera painting that Andrew Wyeth did after the death of his father. And it's Audrey, jump in here too.
Yeah,
I mean,
it was just a few months after his father's death. N.C. Wyeth died along with his young grandson, in a tragic accident. They were driving in a car, and they either stalled on the railroad tracks or something happened, and they were hit by a train not far from here. Not far from the Kerner Farm, which is where Andrew Wyeth would paint for many, many years, right at the base of the hill. And that
both were killed instantly.
Instantly, right. And that really transformed Andrew Wyeth in many ways. He said it was the single most, the biggest turning point in his career, because he began to really think about reasons to paint. He thought he had not really gotten in depth with anything prior to that moment. So with Winter 1946, he describes it as a way of working through his grief, but it's a figure running down a hill, Kerner Hill specifically, which is, as I said, near the place where N.C. died, and it began to take on a form of symbolism, symbolic of his father's death. The hill became symbolic of his father. And the boy running down the hill became symbolic of him, his feeling at loss at that moment. But it also had relations to the big parade specifically.
Right, exactly. Yeah. The hill occurs in the big parade, and the final scene of the big parade is a figure running down a hill very similarly shaped to Kerner Hill. And then to go on with the sort of war analogy, the figure in Andrew's painting wears a vaguely military-style jacket. The hill, of course, is just a desolate hill at this time of year. It was October, it's just brown and whatever. There's a rutted cart track. There's a barbed wire fence. Well, all of those rotogravures and stereoscope cards, views of the war that Andrew had looked at as a child, there were a lot of desolate landscapes and rutted fields marked with barbed wire, which is, of course, an icon of the First World War. So it's all very much tied together, especially, though, to the big parade. This was a movie that he saw first with his father, And then
And his father loved the movie
his
as
father
well.
loved the movie as well, and so the whole thing is tied together.
Do you know if the movie's available? I mean, is it on DVD or?
It is on DVD.
It is,
I bought it.
Is it any good?
It's harder for us to watch, I think, as we're so used to faster moving. It's silent, but yes, it was good, and it was very compelling. And I think that Wyeth later wrote to King Vidor, the director of the film, and talked about how that film influenced him, and it was in his subconscious really for all those years.
The imagery was
there
in his subconscious for all these years.
And I think also the way Vidor told the story, which is through suggestion and realism, and not a straightforward linear manner. Wyeth's work often has meaning that is not always evident when you look at the painting. I mean, you'll see something and you'll wonder what is happening, and you don't know for sure. It's very open-ended in a way, and
it's
I think
very
that's
personal to the artist.
Very personal to the artist, very open-ended. People may look at that painting, Winter 1946, and think, "There's a boy running down a hill. What's he running from? Who's he running towards?" You don't know, but you just know that there's a feeling of angst of some kind happening in that painting.
Well, I want to get you to each talk about this painting here, because this is not the sort of sentimental subject matter that people think of when they think of Andrew Wyeth. What's the story behind this painting, Spring?
Well, first of all, the subject.
And it's in your chapter on
It
war
is,
imagery,
and I talk about it too. It's one of those paintings that's iconic.
right, there is a lot of meaning in it. Andrew Wyeth gave a number of interviews about it, and he again felt that he was sitting with his longtime friend Carl Kerner when Carl was very ill, and Andrew reports that in the conversation it comes up that Carl says something about, "Andy, did you hear that snapping?" And Andrew Wyeth himself, we don't know whether in the telling of it, whether Carl Kerner goes on to say or whether Andrew Wyeth goes on to say that the snapping is the cutting of barbed wire in one of the stories that Carl Kerner told the young Andrew Wyeth when he was just a boy, 8, 9, or 10 years old, going over to visit the Kerners. Andrew Wyeth says that war memory moved him out of the spot from where he was, and he was then able to place Carl into that snowbank. Right. So you can
it's actually on Kerner Hill. So
right.
There's the tie back to his father in a way, because he talks about sitting at his father's body after he had died. He came to the place where he had been laid out and sat there for hours with the body. And I think that partly feeds into this painting as well, because Carl is dying at that moment.
Carl
Kerner
was somewhat of a surrogate father.
Right. So the hill is symbolic of the father, Carl Kerner is symbolic of his father. So a lot goes back to his father very often, and also to the war, as Christine said. There's that war memory that's playing into that painting.
Now, before we run out of time, I want to talk about your chapter, Audrey. Your chapter is the Kerners and the Olsons, and you mentioned both of them, but who were they, and why were they so intriguing for Andrew Wyeth to paint?
So the Kerners lived not far from this studio that we're in right now, just over the bank, I would say.
Right, exactly. It was just down the lane and across a couple private properties.
Yeah. And they, Carl Kerner and his wife Anna lived there. Carl and Anna were both born in Germany, and they came here in the 1920s. After the war, Carl had served in the German army. And they rented this farm, and eventually Carl bought the farm, but he worked the farm since the 1930s. And Carl was very welcoming to Andrew Wyeth when Andrew Wyeth, as a teenager, asked if he could paint on the farm. He was drawn to that farm. He was drawn to, I think, the mechanics of the farm. He was drawn to the earth, the idea of this farmer, with this history of the war behind him, coming to America and having to work this farm, bringing his family along. Anna Kerner, his wife, was always homesick for the old country. So they were a complex couple, and the farm itself was of interest to Wyeth, the physical aspect of it. So Wyeth began painting Carl Kerner 1930s, but he did his first portrait of him in 1948, which was right after, 3 years after his father's death. He met Christina and Alvaro Olson in Cushing, Maine, in 1939. So it was not too long after he met the Kerners, and they became, the Olsons became his subject in Maine. So he would spend 3 to 4 months in Maine out of the year, and the rest of the time in the winter and fall here in Chadds Ford. And I think he was drawn to both of these people, or actually all 4 of these people, because they were outsiders in a sense. Christina had this degenerative disease that caused her to lose ability to walk. Her brother was a former fisherman who had to give up his life as a fisherman to take care of her, and he was, he didn't want to give up that. So being a farmer was not something that he enjoyed. Carl Kerner was an outsider just because of his German heritage. And so Wyeth was drawn to that. He said that he felt like an outsider all his life too, from the time he was a young boy, when he was homeschooled essentially because he was ill, sick at a young age, and he didn't want to go to school. His parents let him stay home. So he was taught at home. So he never really socialized with too many other children. He did socialize with some, but in a sense that was what he was drawn to. He felt a commonality with them.
Did he ever do portraits for hire?
Very rarely. He didn't like to do it at all. He turned down Richard Nixon, who asked, specifically, personally asked Wyeth to paint him. He said no, he wouldn't do it. He did paint a few portraits of Wilmington luminaries, and he didn't enjoy it. So he wanted to find his own subjects, and he was drawn to people in this area. In addition to the Kerners, he also painted the people of a little area around Mother Archie's Church. Mother Archie's Church being an African-American church that was founded in the late 19th century and became a community of people who Wyeth befriended, and he would paint there. And in fact, the cover of the catalog has one such person on there who was local to this area, Willard Snowden. So he thought of portraiture as just simply more than just a depiction of a human being. He saw it as more complex. And so that's one reason the last part of the title of my essay is the symbolic and direct and symbolic portraits, because some of them are portraits of the person, some of them are portraits of places associated with that person.
There were also 2 of his subjects, Siri Erickson and then Helga.
Helga Testorf.
That was fairly late in his life, and it was controversial when the Helga paintings were announced?
Yes, he started painting Siri Erickson first in 1967 or 68, and she was almost a replacement in a sense for Christina Olson, who died early in January of 1968. He was looking for new subjects in Maine, and subconsciously or unconsciously, and he saw Siri Erickson, who was a teenager, and she was a daughter of a farmer. Wyeth started painting her in the nude and also clothed, and they were paintings that were not shown until she was older. She was 19 when they were shown finally. So this is kind of the secret, where the secret life starts almost. He starts painting in 1970 this series of 240 works of Helga Testorf, Chadds Ford. So in both places he's working, he's producing lots of other work, but he's also focused on Helga as well, especially Helga from 1970 to 85, that 15-year period.
Did he just stockpile them and not show them to the public?
Yes, he did. They were hidden at various spots. Some of them were at the Kerner farm, because many of the studies and paintings of Helga were begun in the 3rd floor
One of the
rooms
in the
at
third
at the
floor.
Carter farm. And also, so it was essentially secret from most people.
Did he paint until the end of his life?
Yes.
He did pretty much.
Yeah. His last painting is in the book. It is called Goodbye. It has had various titles, but Betsy Wyeth named many of his works, and she put that title on that painting. And do you know, was it before he died that she named it Goodbye? I'm not sure. Because it was, but she called it Goodbye partly because this painting represents a scene at one of the islands that they owned in Maine, small island, and he would leave the island every Monday or so to go paint at his studio on the mainland. So partly that was the reason for the title.
So it's a boat
It's
going
a boat.
off.
It's a boat going
leading
off. And one of the authors in the catalog writes about these boats. That was a recurring subject in his work, and about how they meant escape, and how they also meant dislocation and abandonment, and these single boats that he often painted. But getting back to your question about the last painting, he started this 91st birthday, I believe, when his wife Betsy gave him as a surprise a rebuilt
sail loft, right,
on the island that had been reconstructed on the island over the winter and spring. So when he arrived in the summer, I think he knew about it, but essentially it was a surprise. So to thank her, he started this painting, and it's kind of an homage to her as well as his last work. I mean, he didn't know it was his last work, of course, but he finished it in the fall of that year, and then he died in January of 2009.
We only have a couple of minutes left. If someone comes to the Brandywine River Museum, what do they see?
Well, there's 3 generations of Wyeths, and also American art, other than the Wyeths. There's some regional focus on the collection, but also beyond that, we also we show works that have an affinity to the region, to the artists in the region.
And they also have the opportunity to tour all 3 of the places that we've spoken about during this hour, the Andrew Wyeth Studio, the N.C. Wyeth Studio, which is an entirely different looking place than this studio, and then also the Kerner Farm as well.
So someone's able to tour the studio?
Yes,
right
tour the studios and the Kerner Farm, yes.
And what should people come away with when they visit here?
Besides what a swell place the museum is?
I think, well, one of the things I think people will feel, if they're coming to see Andrew Wyeth, is when they come into this area, you really feel like you're in Wyeth country in a sense, because so much of his work captures the essence of this part of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and that's something that we didn't really go into that we probably should have, is that the Wyeths were so rooted to this very spot, and they're not rooted to like 2 towns over or 3 towns that way. They're rooted to Chad's Ford and this very spot, and that was right for N.C. Wyeth, and it was also right for Andrew Wyeth. And so when people come here, as Audrey said, they really are getting not only the opportunity to see the art, and if they come to the studio where the art was produced, they're getting to see the environment, the natural setting that inspired a lot of the work.
Well, that'll have to be the last word. We've been speaking with Christine Podmaniczky and Audrey Lewis, and they are 2 of the contributors to this book, Andrew Wyeth in Retrospect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.